It began not with the sound of gunfire, but with the hum of insects. In the dense, airless jungles of New Guinea in 1942, the war did not smell of smoke and oil. It smelled of rot. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, and every breath drew in humidity so thick it felt like breathing through cloth. The men of the US and Australian forces had been told they were landing to fight the Japanese. What they hadn't been told was that the jungle itself would become their deadliest enemy. The first symptoms came quietly. A soldier would wake drenched in sweat, teeth chattering despite the tropical heat. His stomach cramped, his vision blurred. Within hours, his skin burned with fever. The next morning, another man fell, then another. Soon entire platoons were shaking, hallucinating, unable to stand. It was like death creeping up the line, one medic wrote. No bullets, no shells, just the jungle taking them. The doctors knew the name, malaria. A single mosquito bite, a parasite entering the bloodstream, and the soldier was finished. In the swamps and stagnant rivers of New Guinea, mosquitoes were everywhere, invisible snipers, attacking day and night. The men called them the Black Swarm. They rose from puddles, from water-filled footprints, from the damp canvas of tents. Nets were torn, repellents washed away in sweat and rain. It was impossible to escape them. By August 1942, as the campaign for the island began in earnest, malaria was spreading faster than any offensive. American engineers struggled to build airstrips and roads while fever ripped through their ranks. Australian patrols vanished into the green maze and returned days later with half their men delirious. In some units, 80% of soldiers were unfit for combat. You could hear the coughing and the groaning in the dark, Sergeant James Rawlings recalled. You didn't need the Japanese to kill you out here. The jungle was doing just fine. The battle for New Guinea was one of the most brutal of the Pacific War, not only against the enemy, but against nature itself. The Japanese had already learned how to use the terrain. Their troops moved like ghosts through the undergrowth, carrying little more than rice and rifles. The Americans, burdened with heavy packs and untested in jungle warfare, sank knee-deep in mud and despair. Their rifles rusted overnight, their boots rotted from the inside out. Every insect bite could mean infection. Every cut could become a wound that would not heal. But the mosquitoes were the real killers. They bred in the swamps along the Gona front, in puddles beside airstrips, in the flooded footprints of marching men. The medical officers knew what it meant. They had seen it in Panama, in the Philippines, in the Caribbean, but never on this scale. The disease moved faster than any supply convoy. It spread through the night air, through the sweat-soaked tents, through every corner of the jungle where men tried to sleep. At first, commanders underestimated it. Keep the men moving, one general ordered. It'll toughen them up. But toughness meant nothing to malaria. The parasite didn't care about courage or training. It turned heroes into skeletons in days. The medics watched helplessly as soldiers shook violently in their cots, eyes rolling, lips dry and cracked. We were burying more men from fever than from gunfire, wrote an Australian field surgeon at Milne Bay. The Japanese suffered too. In the captured diaries of enemy soldiers, Allied intelligence found similar stories, men writing of fever dreams, of comrades raving in the night, of entire companies too weak to fight. The jungle is full of death, it hums in the air, we are eaten by the sky. The U.S. Army called it non-battle casualties, but to the men on the ground it was war. Medics waged a losing campaign with what little they had, quinine pills and mosquito nets, both in short supply. Supplies of quinine, once sourced from Dutch plantations in Java, had been cut off by Japan's invasion of the East Indies. What remained was rationed carefully. A single glass vial of quinine became more precious than ammunition. Every night medical teams burned coils of repellent and smeared oil on puddles to suffocate mosquito larvae. Soldiers were ordered to wear long sleeves and tuck in their pants despite the heat. Nets were issued and inspected like weapons. Yet discipline broke down under exhaustion. Men forgot. They were too tired to care. Sometimes you just lay there and let the mosquitoes take what they wanted. By September, the situation was catastrophic. At the front lines near Buna, nearly half of the American forces were incapacitated. The Japanese counterattacked repeatedly, but even their strength faltered under the same fever. Battles turned into slow-motion nightmares, men stumbling through mud, firing blindly, collapsing mid-charge. A few steps, a few hours, and then the shakes returned. In field hospitals, the true cost became visible. Rows of cots filled every tent, men trembling under thin blankets, skin yellow with jaundice, lips whispering for water. Some begged for morphine, others just stared at the ceiling, waiting for the fever to break. Nurses and medics worked until their hands blistered. The moans never stopped. They came from every direction, like the jungle was breathing through them. Even General Douglas MacArthur, watching from his headquarters in Port Moresby, began to understand that the war in New Guinea would not be won by tactics alone. The jungle is as much an enemy as Japan. We must conquer both, or we will conquer neither. Orders went out for new medical units, mosquito control teams, and better distribution of drugs. The battle against malaria became an official military campaign, one that would last the entire war. But in 1942, it was still chaos. The men at the front could only endure. They learned to fight fever like they fought the enemy, with grit and superstition. Some believed tobacco smoke kept mosquitoes away. Others slept beside fires, choking on smoke rather than risking another bite. When the fever came, comrades wrapped each other in wet blankets and waited, helpless, for the shaking to stop. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. By the year's end, malaria had struck down nearly 500,000 Allied troops across the Pacific, and more than half of them were in New Guinea. In some units, 9 out of 10 men were infected. The military hospitals overflowed. Doctors had to turn tents and even bomb craters into makeshift wards. The numbers were staggering, and yet somehow, the men kept fighting. The battlefields of Buna, Gona, and Tukota became places where medicine and war merged into one. A soldier could die from a single bullet or a single bite. The difference was only time. For those who lived through it, the memory never left. We fought the Japanese, but the jungle fought us harder. You could shoot a soldier. You couldn't shoot a mosquito. The men didn't know it then, but their suffering would force an army and a nation to reinvent the way it fought. The war against malaria had only just begun.
The front line in New Guinea no longer moved with bullets and bayonets. It shifted with fever charts. By late 1942, malaria had become the single most powerful force on the battlefield. It was invisible, unstoppable, and indifferent to flags. Every mosquito bite was a loaded gun. Soldiers went to sleep as fighters and woke up as patients. The enemy was in their blood. At Allied headquarters in Port Moresby, the reports piled higher than maps. Battalion after battalion was marked combat ineffective. Some units were reduced to 20% of their strength without a single engagement. The sick filled field hospitals faster than replacements could arrive. "We are losing this war to mosquitoes," one medical officer told General MacArthur bluntly. "The Japanese are secondary." He wasn't exaggerating. By the end of 1942, malaria had infected nearly every soldier in New Guinea at least once. Men shivered through 106-degree fevers, while the air around them baked at 100 degrees. They sweated through blankets and collapsed from dehydration. Those who survived the first attack often suffered relapses weeks later. There were men who had malaria 3, 4, even 6 times before the year was out. Doctors could predict the disease's advance almost like weather. Wherever the jungle grew thick and the ground turned to swamp, the fever would follow. At Buna, the mosquitoes swarmed so heavily that guards wore netting over their entire heads. At Milne Bay, the airfields were ringed by ditches of stagnant rainwater, perfect breeding grounds. You could scoop a handful of air, one engineer said, and get 3 mosquitoes in it. Quinine, the only known cure, had become as precious as gold. Before the war, the drug came almost entirely from cinchona plantations in the Dutch East Indies, now occupied by Japan. The loss was catastrophic. The Allied Medical Corps scrambled for alternatives. Some shipments came from India and Africa, but they were small and unreliable. Every bottle was guarded like ammunition. Medics rationed quinine with heartbreaking precision. 0.5 grams per man per day, no more. It was crushed into bitter powder and stirred into water that smelled of gasoline. Men gagged and spat it out, unable to swallow. It tasted like drinking metal, one private remembered, but if you didn't take it, you'd be shaking before morning. The problem wasn't just medicine, it was morale. The disease didn't just weaken the body, it broke the mind. Soldiers grew paranoid, convinced the air itself was poisoned. Fever dreams filled with insects, water, and whispers of death haunted them at night. Some refused to take their pills, claiming quinine was part of a government experiment. Others believed it made them sterile. "We were losing the battle of belief," said Major John Birch, an Army physician, "not just the battle of infection." The U.S. Army Medical Corps fought back the only way it could, with organization and discipline. They declared a new kind of front, the Malaria Front. Instead of rifles and grenades, this war used shovels, oil, and discipline as weapons. The Army created malaria control units, each one made up of doctors, engineers, and laborers whose sole mission was to hunt mosquitoes. They drained swamps, sprayed stagnant pools with oil to suffocate larvae, and cut drainage ditches that scarred the jungle like veins. In villages and camps, soldiers were ordered to cover their skin and sleep under nets. Tents were inspected daily for holes. Mosquito control became a standard line in every unit's orders, as critical as ammunition resupply. Commanders who failed to enforce it faced court-martial. Posters went up across New Guinea. "Discipline is your best medicine." Even so, the results came slowly. The jungle always fought back. Rainstorms filled the ditches, mosquitoes bred in discarded helmets, in tire tracks, in the bottom of empty ration cans. Soldiers cursed the tiny enemy that refused to die. "You could burn a whole camp," one sergeant said, "and they'd be back before the ashes cooled." The Japanese faced the same invisible slaughter. Prisoners captured during the Buna campaign told grim stories. Entire Japanese platoons were wiped out by malaria before the Americans ever reached them. Japanese medics, short on quinine, resorted to boiling bark from the cinchona tree to make crude extracts. "We fight fever and hunger more than Americans," one Japanese diary read. "The jungle kills us both." But unlike the Americans, the Japanese lacked the logistical power to fight back. Their medical supplies were limited, their sanitation poor, and their discipline collapsing under starvation. On New Guinea's northern coast, Japanese garrisons shrank by half within months, not from battle, but from disease. "We could hear them dying in the night," said an Australian soldier near Lae. "They didn't even have to shoot at us anymore." By early 1943, the fever front stretched across the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to New Guinea, from the Solomons to the Bismarck Sea. On every island, in every base, medics fought the same war. Atabrine, a synthetic drug developed before the war, began to replace quinine. It was bitter and caused nausea, but it worked. The problem was getting men to take it. "You could hear them cursing every night," remembered a nurse in Port Moresby. "You'd hand them the yellow pill, and they'd say it glowed in the dark." Still, the orders were absolute. Every soldier in the Pacific was required to take his dose daily, no exceptions. The war against malaria had become a campaign of willpower. In the reports to Washington, the tone changed. The generals were no longer asking for more bullets, they were asking for doctors, for medicine, for discipline. "Our greatest enemy in the South Pacific is the mosquito. If we lose to him, no army on earth can save us." By the end of 1943, malaria had killed or incapacitated more men in New Guinea than all Japanese weapons combined. But something else was happening, the beginning of control. The malaria control units, once overwhelmed, were now efficient, relentless, and respected. The army had learned how to fight the invisible. The fever front was holding. And as 1944 approached, the tide of disease began to turn, not because the jungle had grown less hostile, but because men had learned to adapt to it. The next phase of the war would prove it. The war for blood was becoming a war of science.
By the spring of 1943, the fight against malaria had evolved from chaos to calculation. The front line was no longer in the mud or jungle, but inside the human bloodstream. The enemy wasn't the Japanese infantry or the mosquito itself. It was the parasite, Plasmodium falciparum, an organism so small it could slip unseen through a microscope's glass, yet powerful enough to destroy armies. The US and Australian forces had learned that rifles and courage meant nothing against it. The new weapon would be chemistry. In laboratories from Washington to Melbourne, scientists worked under the same sense of urgency as the soldiers in the field. The old miracle drug, quinine, had nearly vanished from the world. The plantations that produced it were in Japanese hands, and the few shipments smuggled out of Java could supply only a fraction of the army's need. Every fever spike at the front, every shivering man in a jungle cot reminded them that time was running out. At the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research and at pharmaceutical companies like Winthrop and Bayer, chemists pored over formulas day and night, searching for a synthetic replacement. The answer came in the form of a bitter yellow compound called atabrine. It wasn't new, it had been developed years before, but now it became the most important pill in the Pacific. It could suppress malaria, stop the fever before it started, and keep a man on his feet. The challenge was getting 500,000 soldiers to take it. To the men in the field, atabrine was another form of punishment. The tablets were chalky, fluorescent yellow, and carried a metallic taste that clung to the tongue for hours. Worse, rumors spread faster than medical orders. Some soldiers swore the drug caused madness or sterility. Others believed it turned their skin yellow permanently. You couldn't convince a dog to take it, complained one medic. Every excuse in the book. I forgot, I lost mine, it makes me sick. Meanwhile, they're shaking with fever. So the army made it law. In the US forces, taking atabrine became a daily ritual, enforced with military precision. Men lined up after evening chow to swallow the yellow tablets in front of medical officers. It wasn't optional, it was survival. You don't fight the Japanese without fighting the mosquito, declared General Robert Eichelberger of the 8th Army. And you don't fight the mosquito without atabrine. In the Australian Army, malaria discipline became almost religious. Officers carried mosquito nets rolled over their shoulders like sacred banners. Cover up, grease up, pill up, went the saying. Soldiers who forgot were punished the same as if they had lost their rifles. It was the first time in military history that medicine itself was treated as a weapon of war. Still, the disease did not surrender easily. The parasite was cunning. It hid in the liver, waited for the atabrine to fade, then struck again. The fever came in cycles: shivering, sweating, exhaustion, delirium. Some men saw hallucinations so vivid they woke screaming in their tents. Others simply stopped moving, staring into space, their minds broken by the endless waves of sickness. The doctors fought back with science and with faith. Mobile laboratories followed the troops, testing blood samples under lantern light. Field hospitals began recording the first successes. Soldiers recovering faster, relapses dropping, infection rates leveling off. It wasn't victory yet, but it was progress, a slow, invisible tide moving in their favor. And yet, even as the Allies advanced scientifically, the Japanese were trapped in an older war. Their soldiers still relied on quinine, often extracted from bark boiled in makeshift pots. The supply lines from Southeast Asia collapsed under Allied bombing. By late 1943, malaria ravaged Japanese garrisons across the Pacific. On islands like Bougainville and New Britain, Japanese soldiers starved and burned with fever long before American bullets reached them. "The jungle is eating us," wrote one officer in his diary. "We cannot see our enemy, only feel the fever in our bones." The Americans, too, still paid in blood. The New Guinea campaign continued relentlessly. Even with Atabrine discipline, 1 in 5 men was sick at any given time. The heat, the exhaustion, and the endless rain wore down the body's defenses. Medics became soldiers in all but name, carrying rifles in one hand and thermometers in the other. At Dabadura Airfield, an American doctor named Major Charles T. Bewley set up a malaria ward in a tent so full that stretchers lay outside in the rain. He worked 20 hours a day, treating 300 cases at once. "The fever doesn't wait for daylight," he wrote in his log. "You can hear it coming, the moans, the vomiting, the delirium. It's the sound of a battle without gunfire." And yet, in the midst of this misery, the seeds of victory were being sown. Bewley's men discovered that even partial Atabrine doses could keep units functional. By staggering medication cycles and isolating severe cases, they could maintain enough manpower to fight. The doctors began to speak in tactical terms: quarantine perimeter, disease suppression zone. Medicine was becoming strategy. Back in the United States, the Office of Scientific Research and Development, or OSRD, launched Project X-100, a massive collaboration between the military, universities, and industry to produce millions of doses of Atabrine and test new anti-malarial compounds. It was the largest pharmaceutical mobilization in history. Chemists who had never left a laboratory were now part of the war effort, their beakers and pipettes as vital as rifles and tanks. One of them, Dr. Lowell Coggeshall of the University of Chicago, later said, "We weren't just making pills, we were building an army of medicine." By late 1943, the results were undeniable. The infection rate among U.S. troops in New Guinea began to fall. In one division, from 500 cases per 1,000 men per month down to fewer than 50. Atabrine discipline, mosquito control, and education were turning the tide. The war for the Pacific was still raging, but the fever front was finally stabilizing. The parasite was losing ground. In that fragile victory, there was irony. For every soldier saved by Atabrine, another fought through side effects: jaundice, stomach pain, nausea. Yet morale shifted. The men began to believe the medicine worked. They joked about the yellow color of their skin. They called themselves the Lemon Army. A sense of defiance replaced fear. "If this pill keeps me alive, I'll take it by the handful," one Marine said. For the first time since the campaign began, the Allies could see beyond the fever. The war was turning outward again, toward the Philippines, the Marianas, and Japan itself. But behind every advance, behind every airfield built and every island taken, there was another kind of battle being won, molecule by molecule, inside the blood. The soldiers didn't know it, but their discipline, their obedience to a bitter yellow pill, was changing more than their war. It was changing medicine itself. The lessons learned in the jungles of New Guinea would one day shape how humanity fought every epidemic that followed. When the monsoon rains fell again at the end of 1943, soldiers lay in their tents, listening to the drumming on the canvas. They still felt the sting of mosquitoes, but they no longer feared them as before. The fever still came, but it no longer decided the war. The battle of the blood had been fought, and, for the first time, it was being won. By 1944, the fever that had once threatened to destroy armies was now being driven back with precision and purpose. The battle against malaria had become an exact science, a war of schedules, sanitation, and sheer will. The jungle hadn't changed, but the men had. They no longer stumbled through the swamps as strangers. They moved like engineers, medics, and soldiers all at once. Wherever the American and Australian forces advanced, the malaria control units went first, a new kind of vanguard. Before the first infantry patrol stepped onto a beach, teams in khaki shorts and pith helmets were already wading through the mangroves, spraying oil on puddles and digging drainage ditches. They carried shovels instead of rifles, hand pumps instead of grenades. Yet every trench they dug, every swamp they drained, saved more lives than any firefight could. "Our front line," one Army surgeon wrote, runs through every drop of water in the jungle. At Hollandia and Etape, where MacArthur's forces landed on New Guinea's northern coast in the spring of 1944, malaria discipline was enforced like religion. The lessons of the past 2 years had been burned into every order and manual. Before an airfield could be built, the mosquito breeding grounds were mapped, catalogued, and marked for destruction. Before the engineers laid a single plank of runway, they had to clear the marshes. Field reports from Hollandia described the transformation vividly. The camp is surrounded by a perimeter ditch, sprayed daily with diesel oil. All water containers are screened. Nets are mandatory. Atabrine distribution occurs at 1800 hours under armed supervision. Result? 0 new infections this week. 0. That word was more powerful than any victory speech. It meant that the invisible war was finally being won. The soldiers had changed too. They no longer cursed the yellow Atabrine tablets, they swallowed them automatically, part of the daily rhythm of war. Their commanders, once skeptical, now treated malaria prevention as part of tactics. On briefing maps, malaria zones were shaded in red beside Japanese fortifications. To hold ground meant to control both, the enemy and the environment. At company mess tents, medics walked down the rows like priests administering communion, dropping yellow tablets into the hands of sunburned men. "Bottoms up, boys," one sergeant would joke. They'd grin, swallow, and chase the bitterness with black coffee. The ritual gave them something they hadn't had in years, the illusion of control. In truth, it was more than illusion. In the Pacific Theater by mid-1944, malaria rates had fallen by more than 80%. Where once hundreds of thousands were sick, now tens of thousands were healthy enough to fight. The Allied Medical Corps had achieved what many thought impossible. They had turned a disease into a manageable enemy. The Japanese, meanwhile, were dying in silence. On islands across the Bismarck Sea and the Solomons, isolated garrisons were trapped between hunger and fever. With their supply routes cut by American submarines, they ran out of quinine, then Atabrine, then hope. Reports intercepted by Allied intelligence spoke of units reduced to half strength by malaria alone. At Biak, Japanese soldiers too weak to hold rifles dragged themselves into caves to die. "We are being eaten by the air. The mosquitoes have joined the Americans," one diary read. The contrast was staggering. The same jungle that had once been the great equalizer, punishing both sides, now favored those who had learned its laws. The Americans didn't conquer the jungle, they negotiated with it. Every mosquito killed was another step toward victory. At the 19th General Hospital in New Guinea, doctors began compiling data that would astonish even their own commanders. They found that malaria rates among troops who followed full preventative discipline, nets, sleeves, repellents, and Atabrine, were lower than 5%. Among undisciplined units, the rate soared above 70%. The numbers were irrefutable. The war could now be measured not only in miles gained, but in parasites defeated. This success bred a new kind of pride. Soldiers began to view malaria prevention as part of their identity. They'd carve slogans on mess tables: "No Atabrine, no victory." One officer painted it on the side of a jeep. In medical camps, malaria technicians trained local villagers to identify mosquito breeding grounds. For the first time, war and public health merged. "We are fighting for the world that will come after," said Lieutenant Colonel George Hunter, one of the Army's foremost malaria experts. "If we can beat this disease here, we can beat it anywhere." That victory wasn't only measured in lives saved. It changed how the entire war was fought. With the fever front finally under control, the U.S. Army and Marines could plan longer operations. Airfields stayed operational, supply routes remained open, and morale soared. In the Philippines, where MacArthur made his long-awaited return in October 1944, the same medical discipline followed the troops ashore. Before the first Japanese machine gun opened fire on Leyte Gulf, malaria patrols were already spreading oil over standing water near the beaches. They set up sprayers and quarantine tents behind the lines.
To a casual observer, it looked absurd, men fighting mosquitoes while artillery thundered in the distance. But MacArthur's staff knew the truth. Every battle depended on those unseen victories. In his after-action report, MacArthur's surgeon wrote a single, remarkable line. "We have learned that the smallest enemy can destroy the greatest army, and that discipline, not luck, is our armor." Back in the States, posters went up in training camps showing a soldier asleep without a net, a giant mosquito looming over him like a bomber. The caption read, "He forgot his weapon." The idea that a mosquito could defeat an empire no longer seemed absurd. It had already come close. As the Pacific War entered its final grinding year, malaria was no longer the nightmare it once was. The fever still flared, but it was contained, predictable, controlled, and often cured. American medicine had caught up with the jungle. The invisible war was being won by not by generals or by strategy, but by discipline, ingenuity, and science. The soldiers who once lay shaking in their tents were now building airfields, storming beaches, and flying missions, alive because someone had thought to spray a swamp or hand out a pill. It was, in every sense, the quietest victory of the war. At sunset on the New Guinea coast, where the jungle met the sea, the air was still thick with insects. A few years earlier, the men would have flinched, slapped, cursed. Now they smiled, pulled down their sleeves, and went back to work. The mosquitoes still buzzed, but they no longer ruled. The fever had not disappeared, but it had been contained, tamed, and beaten back by human stubbornness. And in the silence that followed, the jungle seemed to acknowledge it.
When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, and the jungles of the Pacific echoed not with war but with rain, a different kind of reckoning began. Victory had come at unimaginable cost. Entire cities erased, fleets sunk, millions dead. Yet among the endless statistics of destruction, another story quietly emerged, one of survival. Of the countless threats that stalked soldiers from Guadalcanal to the Philippines, none had claimed more lives, crippled more campaigns, or tested more endurance than the mosquito. In the post-war briefings at Army headquarters, the figures were astonishing. Across the Pacific, more than 500,000 cases of malaria had been recorded among Allied troops. Entire divisions had been paralyzed for months. But thanks to atabrine discipline, mosquito control, and the relentless work of medical teams, those numbers had fallen dramatically after 1943. The final victory was not just military, it was biological. The war had proven something extraordinary. Humanity could fight disease as effectively as it fought armies. At the Malaria Control Conference held in Washington in 1946, one general summed it up with words that would echo through history. "We learned that courage alone does not win wars, science does." That sentiment was born in the swamps of New Guinea, where every soldier who swallowed a yellow pill, every medic who drained a ditch, and every scientist who mixed compounds under flickering lab lights had helped turn the tide. In hospitals from Brisbane to Manila, the medical corps took stock of their achievement. They had built a system of disease control that spanned continents, the largest medical operation in wartime history. Field reports were compiled into manuals. Laboratory results became textbooks. For the first time, malaria was understood not as a mystery, but as a measurable, controllable enemy. The Allied experience in the Pacific became a blueprint for the modern era. The World Health Organization, founded just a few years later, drew directly from the U.S. Army's malaria programs, its data, methods, and even personnel. The same techniques that saved lives in New Guinea would later be used in India, Africa, and Southeast Asia. The war against fever had evolved into a global campaign against disease. But in 1945, for the men who lived through it, the memory was personal. They carried it home in scars and stories. Veterans of the New Guinea campaign would talk about the shakes more often than the battles. Some could still feel the phantom chills years later, the fever rising from nowhere. "You never forget malaria," one Marine said. "It hides in your blood like a ghost." Not all victories were clean.
Atabrine, the miracle pill that saved thousands, left behind its own controversy. The drug caused side effects: nausea, dizziness, yellowing of the skin. It stained the bodies of those who took it faithfully, turning them into walking symbols of the fever war. And yet, when asked, most soldiers said they'd do it again. It kept me alive. That's all I ever asked from it. The factories that had churned out millions of Atabrine tablets during the war now turned their machines to peacetime medicine. Research continued. New drugs, more effective and less toxic, would follow: chloroquine, primaquine, and others. But every pill carried the same DNA as the bitter yellow tablets that had kept armies standing in the jungle. In that sense, the victory over malaria was more than medical, it was moral. It proved that even in the darkest corners of war, humanity could still build instead of destroy. For the Japanese soldiers who had fought on the other side, the story ended differently. Cut off for supplies and medicine, many never had a chance. Their diaries, found in abandoned caves, spoke of fever and despair. One lieutenant on Bougainville wrote his final entry in trembling handwriting. "The heat has become the sky itself. We cannot rise. The mosquitoes sing louder than the guns." He died the next day. Those words haunted Allied medical officers who read them later. The war had been merciless, but the fever had been impartial. It killed without allegiance. And perhaps that was its final lesson: that nature, in the end, cared nothing for nations or empires. Only science, compassion, and discipline could answer it. When American troops returned home, few spoke of malaria. It wasn't the kind of story that made for medals or parades. Yet among the quiet fraternity of those who served in the Pacific, there was a shared understanding. They had fought two wars, one with bullets, one with blood, and the second had been harder. Doctors who had once worked under canvas tents went on to pioneer peacetime medicine. Colonel James Simmons, chief of the Army's Preventative Medicine Division, later helped establish civilian research institutions. The techniques developed for malaria control, vector mapping, field epidemiology, and sanitation engineering became the foundation of modern public health. The fever front, once a desperate improvisation in the jungle, had transformed into a global model of disease control. In 1947, a young officer named Richard L. Allen, who had served as a malaria control technician in New Guinea, visited one of his old camps. The jungle had swallowed the airstrip, and vines curled over what had once been hospital tents. He walked to the edge of a stagnant pond where he had spent months draining and spraying. The mosquitoes still buzzed, but fewer than before. He smiled. "We won," he said quietly, as if to the insects themselves. The legacy of the fever was not measured in monuments or medals. It lived on in laboratories, hospitals, and clinics around the world. It reshaped the way nations thought about warfare and survival. The U.S. Army had gone into the jungle unprepared for disease and come out with one of the greatest medical victories in human history. Every soldier who had lain awake shaking with fever, every medic who worked until dawn, and every scientist who refused to give up had all been part of the same invisible army. And when the world looked back at the Pacific War, it realized that not all heroes carried rifles. Some carried microscopes, some carried shovels, some carried little yellow pills that tasted like poison and saved millions. In the end, the story of malaria in World War II wasn't just about death, it was about endurance. It was proof that even in the most merciless war humanity had ever known, life could still find a way to fight back. Because in the jungles of New Guinea, amid the rot, the mud, and the fever, men learned one of the hardest lessons of all: that victory doesn't always roar from the sky or rise in smoke from the battlefield. Sometimes victory is silent, and it hums in the wings of a dying mosquito.